For many years, I was considered number one in the entire world. But then, for a whole decade, I lived a quiet and simple life, deep in the mountains. Day after day, the same old routine, tending flowers, growing vegetables, and cultivating in silence. During this phase, countless powerful experts and spellmasters came in the cultivation world, and rumors about me gradually faded. The situation became such that no one even mentioned my name. Then, one day, everything changed. A clumsy girl suddenly broke through my barrier and destroyed my vegetable field. One now subtailed. Poor girl cried and apologized repeatedly, dying to clean up the mess. She cried and said, with a great difficulty, I was selected into the Jiang Sect. But no one there is willing to accept me as their disciple. Everyone thinks I'm stupid and doesn't want to teach me. Even though the Ian family had clearly stated that my talent was extraordinary when I saw her. I didn't find even a trace of spiritual power in her body, ma'am. She couldn't even remotely be called talented. But she was so loud and stubborn that I had no choice but to accept her as my disciple. But when I examined her body thoroughly, I realized that she was a once in a minus 10,000 year chaos Dao body. Those old fools of the Swantien Sect had almost ruined a true genius. 5 years passed like that. I transformed Jiang Shuyan from a normal person who couldn't even sense Qi into a graceful girl whose cultivation had steadily reached the late golden core stage. Now, in addition to her daily cultivation, she tended the garden, washed clothes, and cooked dirt. She lived a difficult life in the valley, but she never complained once. Instead, she seemed completely satisfied. Then, one day, when I returned from fishing, I saw her using a small water spell to water of the crop, Suzuma. Her control had become extremely purified. I called out to her. She immediately stopped. Like an obedient child, she ran over and took the fish basket from my hands, smiling sweetly without a word. I looked at her calmly and said, "Your cultivation is now stabilized. It's time for you to go down the mountain." Hearing this, her smile froze, her eyes turned red, and she asked with a choked voice, "Master, are you abandoning me?" But I ignored her tears and continued, "You'd go back to the Swantien Sect. 5 years ago, they called you trash and said you had no future. Bye. Now you will go back and show them how blind they were. My disciple can't carry around the tag of a waste all his life." She bit her lips, hesitation evident in her eyes. She whispered, but then I interrupted her, "No ifs and buts. You are my disciple. You must reclaim what is yours. Those who once slighted you, today you will force them to respect you." Then I took a jade pendant from my rope. It was a simple piece engraved with a single character. A pendant I hadn't cultivated with my life-bound technique for 100 years. Tying it around her waist, I said, "With this there are very few people in this world who can harm you. Go finish what's left unfinished and then come back. Bia." She nodded, tears still welled in her eyes. She bowed 3 times with a heavy heart, placing her head on the ground and saying, "Master, take care of yourself, take care of yourself. I will never let your name die." Then she left, glancing back every few steps until her figure disappeared into the recesses of the valley. Eon on. After her departure, the valley returned to its former tranquility, as if nothing had ever happened. Days fell back into that quiet, monotonous routine. Though I occasionally remembered her clumsy figure while watering the crops, everything else was normal. It hadn't even been 10 days. That afternoon, I was watering a cabbage plant. Suddenly, my heart pounded as if someone had struck it with an invisible hammer. The bucket of water fell from my hand with a loud clang. The water spilled onto my feet. I immediately knew it was the jade pendant, and it had broken. A chilling chill ran through my heart. A sense of intent arose, a feeling I hadn't felt in the past 10 years, because that pendant was made from my century-old life-bound technique, and it contained a portion of my divine sense. Even if it were an old monster, it would have to deal with that sense before harming Zhou, Mi, and Nang. Anyone capable of destroying her would be at the nascent soul or spirit transformation stage, so it's not fair that such an expert suddenly appeared in this cultivation world, Anyone at that level would definitely have recognized the aura of my technique on the pendant, and even after knowing this, they dared to kill her. This meant they were coming for me. Thinking about this, I laughed coldly. Good, very good. Then I walked towards the center of my vegetable field, where a crooked wooden stick lay embedded in the ground. Something I had casually planted 10 years ago to support the bean vines. The sword I had given him was now completely rotten and looked like it would break at the slightest touch. But as I grabbed it and slowly pulled it out of the mud, all the dust fell away, and in this sunlight, a deep, hair-raising glow suddenly flashed. Its rotten outer layers began to fall off inch by inch, revealing a sharp, gleaming blade hidden within. And on that sword, beneath the layers of rust, ancient letters faintly appeared, Vithayan. I muttered softly, no blood has been shed for 10 years. I wonder if my old partner has also rusted away. Then I took my sword and went into the courtyard, where a broken blue flower pot had long since dried up, filled with only dry soil. I gave it a single kick and shattered it into pieces. Digging through the soil, I pulled out a bundle wrapped in oil that had almost melted. As I opened it, the wrapping dissipated into dust, and from within emerged a dark, old, butterfly-shaped token. Its markings had almost disappeared, yet a heavy ancient aura emanated from it. After placing it inside my rope, I stood in the courtyard, sword in hand, and thought, for 10 years I hid in these mountains. Have the people of this world forgotten my name? Have they forgotten that my sword always hung over their heads? And what a terror it was! These obvious fools dared to consider themselves messiahs, creating their own sects right under my nose. And now they dared to touch my disciple. With this thought, I took a step forward and my figure vanished from the valley. All that was left behind was the ruined vegetable field and the broken flower pot. It seemed like the time had come to remind this world of Lubei's name once again. Following the faint aura emanating from the broken jade pendant, I set off eastward. There was no hurry. I simply took a leisurely step forward. With each step, the mountains and rivers beneath my feet seemed to shrink and recede, After spending 10 years in the mountains, I could clearly feel that the spiritual energy of this world had become very thin and weak. Even the quality of the cultivators had fallen drastically. Shortly after leaving the mountain, I overheard a group of young cultivators talking. They were dressed in bright and expensive clothes. Their accessories were also quite exquisite. Jade pendants hung from their waists, and a clear pride was visible on their faces. Just by looking at them, I could tell they were disciples of a large and renowned sect. One said, "Did you hear that trash from the Swantien Sect? Jiang Shuyan somehow got lucky after going down the mountain and successfully formed her foundation form." Another laughed and replied, "So what? If she formed her foundation form, a useless waste that can't even release spiritual power, she'll still be bottom-tier trash." Another added with, "Hey Ti Mao, I heard she even injured senior brother Gu Yunfei." What a dare! Senior brother Gu is Sect Master's personal disciple. A true genius. That trash girl must have used some nasty demonic trick. Just then, another voice said, "I heard the Set has already captured her and she's being tortured and interrogated at the mountain gate." At that very moment, my hand holding the tea bowl paused. Then I slowly walked over and stood directly in front of their table. I asked him calmly, "Where's the way to the Swantien Sect?" The leader looked me up and down. My rough linen clothes and the broken iron sword in my hands shone with pure hatred and contempt in his eyes. He laughed and said, "Who are you, man? Now people like you will ask about the Swantien Sect. Get out of here." I didn't say anything further. I just raised one finger slightly. A faint, almost invisible sword energy emerged from my fingertip and silently sliced through their table. They all froze for a second, but the next moment horror was evident on their faces. The swords that had been hanging proudly in their rooms had been cut in two, right down the middle, right down. The cuts were as smooth as glass in the severed, fell to the ground with a loud thud, and they hadn't even noticed my move. The boy's face went completely white and he was pointing at me with trembling hands, and I asked again in the same calm voice. You can tell he immediately pointed in a direction and stammered. He didn't dare say another word. As I continued on, I couldn't help but wonder what had become of this new generation of the cultivation world. They couldn't even withstand a single blow from my most ordinary sword energy. How boring these people are following the path he had indicated. In less than half a day, a huge mountain appeared. There was a huge gate with the words Swantien Sect written on it in bold letters. This signified the growing influence and status of this so-called great sect. But look at their misfortune. Their status was about to end today. A huge crowd had gathered in front of the mountain gate. People were packed on top of each other so much so that it was suffocating. Without any effort, I pushed through them and reached the center of the square. Blood. The sight made my blood boil. Shuyan was tied to a black rope with chains as thick as his arms. She was tied to a stone pillar. Her entire body was covered in blood. Her once clean clothes were now tattered. Her head hung limply to one side, almost unconscious. Right in front of her stood a haughty young man. This was definitely the Gunt that they had mentioned, but he held a long whip sparking lightning in the air. He looked at Shuyan with a ferocious, satisfied look, lashing out at her back. As the whip landed on her back, another burn wound appeared, accompanied by a lightning bolt. He shouted, "Tell me, where did you learn this technique? What demonic path are you following?" Xiaoyan's body trembled violently with pain, but she bit her lip, refraining from even a scream. "That bastard Hassa is still stubborn." Yeah, finally, she raised her voice. "Who is he, the master of yours who taught you all this to a trashy girl like you? Name him. Maybe I'll teach you an easy lesson. I'll kill him." Hearing this, the disciples standing nearby burst into loud laughter. They started pointing fingers at him and mocking him. When I saw the whip about to fall again, when I saw the Deep wounds on my disciples' back and the disgusting smile on their faces, I slowly raised my hand. The broken iron sword in my hand emitted a faint echo, and the next instant, a streak of light, so bright it was almost invisible, cut through the air. Air. The smile on Guanfei's face froze. He slowly looked down with great sorrow. My rusty sword had pierced his chest. Blood was dripping from the blade, and his life was rapidly fading away. Every eye in the crowd followed the sword straight to me, who was standing unnoticed in the corner of the square. As I took each step forward, Guanfei's remaining breath was dying away. By the time I reached him, the light in his eyes had completely vanished, and he was dead. I didn't even glance at his corpse. Turning my gaze upon the loose, frightened disciples of the Swantien Sect, I said, with a calm yet terrifying fury, "I am his master. Anyone have a problem?" As I spoke these words, a silence descended over the entire arena, which was immediately shattered by a massive wave of fear. The disciples standing in the first row collapsed to the ground in fear, unable to even stand. Just then, an elder wearing a robe stepped forward. Shaking with anger and fear, he pointed his finger at me and shouted, "You wicked fool! How dare you come to the gates of the sentient Sect and murder the Sect Master's personal disciple?" But I hadn't the slightest interest in talking to him. I just glanced at him once. That single glance of mine held a sword intent I hadn't used in 10 years. His voice stopped, the anger and fear on his face froze as countless fine lines of blood erupted beneath his skin. In the next second, his entire body turned into a mass of flesh and blood like broken glass. Not even his soul had a chance to escape. Just then a loud scream ruptured from the crowd in the entire square. The disciples ran for their lives inside the Sect, shouting, "Open the grand for me. Activate the formation." With a powerful rumble, the main peak of the Swantien Sect began to shake, and a massive blue barrier rose in the sky, covering the entire mountain gate like an inverted bowl. On the surface of that barrier floated rooms with ancient and majestic auras. This was the foundation of the Swantien Sect, a formation that was said to be able to easily withstand the full force of even a spirit transformation cultivator. When I saw the disciples hiding behind that barrier, their hearts still trembling, their eyes clearly filled with hatred for me, and their eyes clearly filled with hatred for me and the relief of their own survival, I almost laughed. They truly thought they were safe. I stepped forward, bed in hand, and stopped in front of the massive light curtain. I slowly raised my hand and lightly touched the floating formation with the tip of my finger, and right there, a crisp sound, like the gentle cracking of glass, resounded at the moment my finger touched. From there, a fine, almost invisible crack spread outward at a frightening speed. One after another, the cracks spread like a spider web until they covered the entire barrier. The expressions on the faces of those disciples of Swantien Sect changed from relaxed to absolute horror, and with a deafening explosion, the so-called immortal grand formation shattered into countless fragments of light and vanished into thin air before their eyes. What followed was pure slaughter. My figure vanished from where I stood, and I became an invisible shadow tearing through the panicked crowd. That outer disciple, who had once mocked Amion, saying she couldn't sense the ant's sense, stabbed Wanyan straight through his neck. The arrogance on his face was frozen forever. It was done. That inner disciple, who had once deliberately thrown dirty water on me, I hurled a talisman at him, which burst into raging flames, reducing him to ashes along with his screams. And every single person who had stood beneath that punishment platform and laughed. I remembered their faces. Venthon seemed to come alive in my hand. Each swing was taking the life directly from the person who had once humiliated my disciple. The white stone ground of the mountain gate was red with blood, and the stench of death permeated the air. This place was no longer a sacred cultivation ground, but a living hell. Their proud techniques seemed like child's play before me, their priceless artifacts shattering at the touch of my sword. A fear gripped every heart they had never felt before as they realized they had not just dealt a mere cultivator, but death itself. As I took that last elder's life, the killer was the one who'd even raised his hand against Omnion himself. Suddenly, from the depths of Main Peak, a terrifying aura emerged, dozens of times stronger than Jiang Shuyan's sons. It shook the entire Swantien Sect. An angry, thunderous voice echoed in my ears. A streak of light shot from the peak and landed directly in the center of the square. There stood a man wearing a gold-embroidered dark Sect Master's robe and a crown on his head. His gaze was extremely cold and imposing. His spiritual power was seething like madness. It was clear he was a late-stage spirit transformation cultivator. As soon as he landed, his fell upon the corpses, and rivers of blood scattered on the ground. Baka. His face instantly contorted with uncontrollable killing intent, and his eyes fixed on me like swords. He roared, "Did you kill my disciple?" But I didn't respond. I simply stared at the blood-dripping victim. I grabbed him and looked at him with mild interest to me. My silence only made him madder, and he was furious. Good. Very good. Since I started this Swantien Sect this 300 years ago, you're the first person who's dared to show off so much, oh matcha. Today I will shatter your soul into pieces and ensure you never have another life. As soon as his voice stopped, a long green sword appeared behind him with a loud clang. Its aura cut through the clouds, shaking the winds, and even the sky began to change color. The remaining disciples shouted in excitement. This is Sect Master's personal weapon, the Qingshan sword. Now this map. A new ray of hope lit up in their Sect Master performed hand seals. He recited some incantations, and the Qingshan sword glowed so brightly that it transformed into a massive blade dozens of meters long. It came crashing down on me with full force. It was powerful enough to tear mountains and rivers apart, absorbing all the surrounding spiritual energy, and yet I simply stood there still. I even laughed a little, because the starting stance of that sword technique, the way it circulated spiritual energy, and the incomplete maneuver hidden within it were all so familiar to me. Even though he had clumsily altered it into something strange, it was actually my old technique. I recognized it immediately because it was nothing more than a rough draft I had created hundreds of years ago, one I would casually scribble on paper while experimenting with sword techniques. I don't know how those pages of junk got passed around, and this fool accepted it as the supreme scripture of his sect. I raised my head and looked intently at his face, red with anger, a very old, simple, and aggressive version of it from the depths of my memories. The image began to overlap with this man's face, and only then did I realize, hey, this is the same average junior who used to follow me around with fire in his eyes, shouting, "Senior brother, Lu." And now, thanks to a few pieces of trash I threw, this brother has become a Sect Master. What a profound irony, as his blow, capable of splitting an entire mountain in two, came down towards me. I find only flint, but didn't draw my sword or use any spiritual energy to defend myself. I simply raised two fingers and gently caught the massive blade between them. Instantly, a terrifying blast of sword energy erupted, devastating everything around us. But the blast didn't move me even an inch. The anger and joy of victory Kiko on his face froze, replaced by a deep sense of confusion and fear. He stammered, "This is impossible, lossable." He frantically began pouring more and more of his spiritual power into the Qingshan sword, hoping to move it even slightly. I observed his futile struggle and calmly asked, "Whoa, who taught you such a cheap and weak akrogoga quickala?" My words shattered whatever little courage he had left. His face burned with rage. He roared, and he poured all his strength into the sword. The blade trembled violently and, seemingly screaming in pain as it tried to break free from my grasp. "Break it, you bastard!" He yelled with all his might, and its green light was so bright it blinded the eyes. But a firefly can never shine brighter than the sun. Before the wide-eyed eyes of everyone standing there, the Qingshan's sword, he considered a divine weapon in the sentient insect, cracked at its tip, and instantly crumbled to the ground. As his personal weapon was destroyed, his soul suffered a tremendous blow, and he vomited a mouthful of blood on the spot. He spat blood, and his entire body seemed to age decades in an instant. His aura had almost vanished. He staggered back, pointed at with a trembling finger, and his eyes held nothing but pure fear. "So who are you?" But I had no time for any further nonsense. I pulled my fingers back and slowly started toward him. My steps were light and unhurried, but each step fell like a heavy hammer on the hearts of every person standing there, and under that invisible pressure, the remaining disciples and elders were forced to retreat again and again. Some of them were so shaky in their legs that they collapsed on the ground. Meanwhile, the Sect Master was trying to escape, but my presence had already locked him in place. His body had become as stiff as stone. He couldn't even move a finger. Now he could only helplessly watch me approach him. I could see him raise his hand. A final twinge of desperation flashed in his eyes, as if he wanted to blast his very soul to avenge me. But I said calmly, "You don't even have the guts to blast yourself in front of me." And my palm lightly touched his lower abdomen. Just a gentle touch, and I pulled my hand back. But his entire body ached as if he'd been struck by lightning. And as he looked down at his dongan, his expression changed from confusion to endless despair, because the spiritual power he'd cultivated over hundreds of years began flowing uncontrollably like water from a broken dam, escaping his veins and meridians and flowing back into the his once solid dantian shrank like a punctured balloon, no longer able to hold a single ounce of energy, and his cultivation rank began to plummet at a visible speed, from spirit transformation to nation soul, then golden, and in no time became an ordinary human being, someone who could never cultivate. With a choked voice, he screamed like a madman, My cultivation fell to the ground like a dying fish, writhing and gasping for breath. His bloodshot eyes were fixed on me, as if trying to find something familiar in my technique, in my dominating and crushing style. Slowly, the greatest fear buried in the deepest recesses of his memory began to awaken. He remembered the face from hundreds of years ago that had brought an entire era to its feet, like a god or devil. He remembered the techniques he kept hidden in a vault that were nothing more than my discarded, rough drafts. He remembered that terrifying presence that could conquer entire worlds with a single sword, And as the image of that legend overlapped with the man standing before him, his pupils contracted violently, his lips trembled, and with his last remaining strength, he whispered, so you are Lubei. Lubei, mouse? Without any emotion, I held him back. I looked down, as one would a mere insect, because maiming it was just the beginning. I didn't look back at it after that. This once-jumping insect no longer deserved my attention, Instead, I slowly raised my gaze to the towering, mean peak in the distance, the true foundation of the Swantien Sect, the spiritual vein that had preserved its glory for hundreds of years. I thought to myself 10 years have passed since I returned to the mountains and mountains. This sword named Venthon lay buried in my vegetable field. I was using it as a mere pole to support the cucumber and bean vines. Its killing intent had been lost somewhere in the smoke of a simple life, but now, perhaps it had sensed my will. A low, excited echo emanated from it. I murmured softly, I have grown vegetables for 10 years and nurtured this sword for 10 years. Today I will once again show the world its true power. The blades remind me. Then I gently raised the Vayusium above my head, and at that very moment the wind ceased. The clouds froze, and a silence descended upon the entire world, as if time itself had stopped. All sound and color vanished, and only one thing remained. Between the sky and the earth, the terrifying sword intent, blasting from within me and my blade. This wasn't a blazing spiritual light, nor was it some devastating demonic energy. It was a pure, absolute will, powerful enough to tear apart everything. The remaining disciples of the Swantien Sect watched in horror as the grand protective formation they had relied on melted like ice in the sunlight before that sword intent. Then I swung the sword down. There was no deafening sound, in fact, no sound at all, as if time and space had ceased to exist. A gray sword aura emerged from the blade, invisible to the human eye. It appeared slow, but his speed was beyond imagination. He silently landed on the main peak of the Swantien Sect. For a moment, everything was completely still. Then there was a faint cracking sound, as if the beginning of a great catastrophe. And before everyone's wide-eyed eyes, a deep, endless crack tore the entire mountain in two from peak to base. Only then did a terrifying thunder resound, shaking the heavens and the earth. The spiritual vein that kept this sect alive was cut off. In an instant, countless springs of spiritual energy surged forth like a surging flood, turning into a massive storm. The entire mountain began to collapse. Huge rocks fell, and the earth shook. And in an instant, the once majestic Swantien Sect, once considered the rising powerhouse of the cultivation world, was reduced to a pile of rubble before my eyes. When the storm subsided and the dust settled, I slowly advanced, dragging my sword across the ground. The sword left deep marks on the broken stones, as if a slashing sound had been heard. It was as if I was writing on paper I was leaving behind words filled with killing intent that would make even cultivators thousands of years from now tremble in fear. And on that devastated land, there was only one sentence written. Anyone who harms my disciples will have their entire sect wiped out. And from today on, Lubei Mu's name would no longer be a forgotten legend, but a living terror looming over the entire cultivation world. After finishing all this, I placed Wangan on my shoulder casually, as if carrying a kitchen knife. Behind me was the wreckage of the set and the gaping wound in the ground that every cultivator who sees it in the future will shudder, while before me was the deathly silent field and the few survivors of the Swantien Sect lying on the ground with their eyes lost, as if their souls had been squeezed out. But I didn't even spare them a glance. I headed straight for the punishment platform in the center. The air was heavy with blood, dust, and a suffocating sense of fear. But none of this meant anything to me, because my disciple, Jiang Shuyan, was still chained to that cold iron pillar. His once someone's cheerful face was now as white as paper. His breathing was so weak, it seemed she would break in an instant, but she was conscious, and when she raised her head and looked at me, a faint glint flashed in her lifeless eyes, which was immediately drowned in a flood of tears, which was With a choked voice, she said with great difficulty, "Master, for a semester remaining strength gave way." She gripped my clothes tightly, her tears soaking my chest. The chain that bound her was made of a special cold iron designed to completely block a cultivator's meridians. But I didn't even bother to draw my sword. I simply raised 2 fingers and lightly flicked the chain, and with a crisp sound like a snapping thread, those so-called unbreakable links crumbled inch by inch into dust. As soon as the chain support was removed, she collapsed forward straight into my arms. She was so light and lighter than the largest pumpkin in my garden. As I held her, I could clearly feel that her meridians had been broken in her. The damage to her internal organs was extensive, and I immediately placed my palm on her back and slowly guided a gentle stream of pure spiritual energy through her body, repairing her broken pathways and stabilizing her waning life force. Gradually, her trembling stopped and her breathing returned to normal. As I looked down at her tear-soaked face, my heart, which had been as still as a dry well for the past 10 years, finally melted. I said lovingly, everything is fine now. I'm here. I'm taking you home. My voice was quiet, but it echoed far and wide across the silent field. With that, I turned around, scooped her up in my arms, and walked away. I left behind countless glances filled with respect and wonder, the destruction of an entire satin and the rebirth of a legend, but I didn't look back even once. After a long walk, her condition finally stabilized. In a very weak and choked voice, she softly asked, "Master, are we going back to Nonchan?" I replied without hesitation, "Of course, we're going home, step by step." I brought her back to Nonchan. The wreckage of the Swantien Sect and the passion that had shaken the entire cultivation world were no longer my concern as my world once again shrank to this quiet mountain and the girl in my arms. The small wooden house was exactly the same as it always had been. Even in my absence, the plants in the courtyard, thanks to the formation, were perfectly tame. The sun was lush. I gently laid Shirley down on her bed in her room where, exhausted and injured, she immediately fell into a deep sleep. I didn't use any fancy or complicated medications to heal her. Instead, I drew pure spiritual energy from a waterfall behind the mountain to cleanse and heal her wounds, and then I took an old dust-covered wooden box from under the bed, removed a strange dark pill, and mindlessly stuffed it into her mouth. Mine. It was something I'd once made up as a joke, and I'd forgotten its exact effects. All I remembered was that it replenished energy like candy when it was high. After that, my days returned to the same routine of growing vegetables, fishing, and fetching water. The only difference now was that a small shadow always followed me. When Xiaoya woke up, she wasn't as loud or crying as before she was gone. Instead, she had become much calmer and more diligent. She would wake up every morning before sunrise and practice the techniques I had taught her over and over again. After facing life and death, the true potential of her Chaos Dao body had fully awakened. Her spiritual energy was no longer stagnant, but flowed like a surging river. Each of her movements was accompanied by a powerful aura that sometimes even surprised me. Her doll heart had become completely unbreakable. Meanwhile, I was still as lazy as ever. I took my viand back and buried it in the vegetable patch. Occasionally, I would take it out to harvest fruit or to chase away any stray wild animals that wandered nearby. And I casually buried the old boss of paper I had dug up from the ground under the soil. I patted the soil down firmly so they wouldn't wash away the next time I watered the plants. Everything returned to the same calm and rhythm as 10 years ago. This calmness was so unreal that sometimes it felt as if the massacre at the Swantien Sect was nothing but a forgotten dream. But the cultivation world hadn't forgotten that scene. Now, if some foolish young cultivators even strayed within a 100-mile radius of my barrier, they would suddenly feel as if they had hit an invisible wall and flee trembling with fear. Gradually, this entire area of Nonchan became a forbidden zone for the entire world. Meanwhile, countless rumors about me began to spread throughout the cultivation world. Some said that Lubei had returned to wipe out the sects. Some claimed that I had embarked on a demonic path and that the slaughter that day was to acquire some ancient demonic artifact. Yeah, some even went so far as to say that I've been dead for a long time and what they saw that day was some ancient monster come to life. But no matter how much the stories changed, they always ended with the same thing: you can mess with anyone in this world, but don't even accidentally step into the fields of Nonchan, bouquet. And no matter what happens, never lay a hand on that girl. The same girl who is said to cry easily.